This is not a story about refugees. It is a forensic analysis of how a NATO member state dismantled the global asylum regime to survive a hybrid war. December 2023, a snowy forest track near Vaalimaa, Finland. Border guards and their dogs patrol a narrow clearing between two worlds. Finland on one side, Russia on the other. The temperature is 20 degrees below freezing. The forest is absolutely silent. And that silence is not an accident. It is the result of a hard, mechanical decision by the Finnish state leadership to sever a connection that has existed for decades. Finland just did something almost no other country in modern history has dared. It shut down its entire 1,340-kilometer land border with Russia. Every single crossing point, from the busy ports of the south to the remote Arctic tracts of the north. The result was a statistical anomaly. By March 2024, 0 new arrivals were recorded. 0. This was not a gradual political wind-down or a diplomatic warning. It was a total mechanical shutdown of a national frontier. And it worked. Finland did not close its border because of a conventional migration crisis. It closed it because 1,300 people became pawns in a geopolitical chess game between NATO and the Kremlin. To understand this pivot, we must deconstruct the variables of geography and the price of security in a post-neutral world. For 72 years, Finland played the neutrality game with surgical precision. Sharing the longest EU border with Russia, it maintained a cautious, functional relationship with Moscow, balancing trade and diplomacy while staying out of the military alliances of the West. Then came February 2022. The Russian invasion of Ukraine changed the entire security architecture of the North within 72 hours. Finland realized that neutrality was no longer a shield, it was an open flank. In April 2023, the country officially joined NATO. Overnight, the border became the NATO eastern frontier, and Finland became Moscow's primary strategic nuisance. The Kremlin's reaction did not come with tanks or troop deployments. It came through the logistics of human migration. In late 2023, border guards at remote posts reported a statistical outlier that alerted the national security apparatus. Migrants from Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Somalia were arriving at the Russian side of the border in organized groups. They were not walking from nearby Russian cities, they were being delivered in convoys. Specifically, they were arriving on bicycles, a tactical detail used to exploit a Russian regulation that forbids crossing the border on foot. The Russian border guards, who usually strictly enforce exit permits, were suddenly waving these groups through. Documents and intelligence reports later confirmed that many of these individuals were issued Russian transit visas specifically for the purpose of reaching the Finnish border. Within weeks, the numbers spiked from isolated cases to over 1,300. In small communities like Lima, with barely 100 residents, migrants suddenly outnumbered the local population. Processing systems for asylum claims, designed for high-trust individual cases, collapsed almost overnight. Helsinki recognized the pattern immediately. It was instrumentalized migration. It was the same strategy seen in 2021 at the Belarus-Poland border, where people were used as a weapon to exert political pressure and test the resolve of the state. It was the Kremlin's punishment for Finland's NATO accession. But the real crisis was not the number of people. 1,300 arrivals is a manageable logistical problem for a nation of 5.6 million with a functioning welfare state. The crisis was purely political and systemic. Prime Minister Petteri Orpo led a center-right coalition that included the nationalist Finns Party. This faction did not demand humanitarian corridors or integration programs. They demanded the total securing of sovereignty and the closure of the frontier. They framed the influx not as a refugee flow, but as a hybrid attack on the state itself. By late November 2023, the pressure became unsustainable. On November 18th, Finland shut down 4 eastern crossings. When the flow simply redirected to the remaining points, they closed those too. Finally, on December 15, 2023, Finland shut down the entire 1,340-kilometer land border. The only thing left moving was one freight rail line at Vinicula. But the government knew a temporary closure was not a permanent solution. They needed a legal framework that would survive the scrutiny of the European Court of Human Rights. They needed a tool that allowed them to turn people away, even if they claimed asylum. They needed a constitutional nuclear option. Enter the Act on Temporary Measures to Combat Instrumentalised Migration. The government started drafting this law in early 2024. It was controversial from the first paragraph because what they were proposing was a fundamental suspension of the right to seek asylum. The law granted Finnish border guards the power to refuse entry and reject asylum claims from anyone arriving via Russia on the spot. There would be no processing, no case-by-case assessment, and no judicial review. Decisions made by a border guard at the fence could not be appealed. It was the de facto suspension of the 1951 Refugee Convention on Finnish soil. The Chancellor of Justice, the nation's top legal officer, warned it violated the Constitution and international human rights obligations. Amnesty International and the UN Refugee Agency issued joint statements urging Finland not to violate the fundamental principle of non-refoulement, the rule that you cannot send people back to a place where they face persecution. Over 200 academics signed an open letter arguing the government was exaggerating the threat to justify gutting asylum protections. But the government refused to blink. Interior Minister Matti Rantanen argued clinically, normal asylum procedures do not work when a hostile foreign power is deliberately weaponizing migration. She stated that national security is the prerequisite for all other rights. To pass this law, the government needed a 2/3 supermajority in parliament, an extremely high political stake. They framed the vote as a test of national loyalty in the face of Russian aggression, and it worked. On July 12, 2024, the Finnish parliament voted 167 in favor, 31 against. Finland had given itself legal permission to ignore international law. The border stayed closed. On April 4, 2024, the government extended the closure until further notice. In March 2025, Parliament voted to extend the emergency law through the end of 2026. The practical effects of this decision were absolute and immediate. By mid-2025, illegal crossings dropped to near zero. Asylum applications collapsed by 45%. Finland received fewer than 3,000 applications in 2024, down from over 5,300 the year prior. They weren't just closing the front door, they were clearing out people already inside. Voluntary returns surged by 73%. Deportation orders jumped by 64%, affecting mostly Russian, Iraqi, and Turkish citizens. The Finnish Immigration Service, Migri, revoked over 500 residence permits in a single year. The state was actively shrinking the existing migrant population. 18 reception centers were closed as the system was dismantled in real time. The dark genius of the Finnish approach is that they have not even had to use the pushback law in practice yet. The mere existence of the legal mechanism, combined with the total border closure, served as a complete deterrent. Would-be asylum seekers knew that even if they reached the Finnish fence, their claims would not even be acknowledged. Smuggling routes quickly redirected away from the Finnish border toward Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. Finland had successfully made its problem someone else's. Across Eastern Europe, other countries were watching and taking notes. Poland had already passed pushback legislation in 2021. Lithuania and Latvia followed in 2022 and 2023. All cited the same justification: hybrid warfare and instrumentalized migration. The Finnish playbook was spreading fast, creating a fortified belt along the NATO eastern flank. The European Union, meanwhile, was quietly enabling this shift. In 2024, the EU introduced new crisis regulations that gave member states limited exemptions from standard asylum procedures during emergencies. It wasn't a free pass, but it provided just enough legal cover for governments to justify tougher border policies that would have previously been struck down by EU courts. But this raises a structural problem. Who defines what counts as an emergency? Finland decided that 1,300 asylum seekers over a few weeks constituted a national crisis. Poland decided 4,000 was a crisis. Italy and Greece deal with tens of thousands. By setting the threshold so low, Finland has normalized the idea that asylum rights can be suspended at any time for security reasons. Critics warn this is a race to the bottom. If a major Western democracy like Finland can ignore the 1951 convention, what is to stop any EU member from militarizing its borders and declaring every migrant a weapon of war? The precedent is set, and it is spreading. Finland's government insisted this was about capability, but the data suggests it was about willingness. Finland is a nation with functioning institutions and massive resources. 1,300 people was never a logistical crisis. It was a political opportunity to dismantle a system that the nationalist factions of the government had been eyeing for years. They made the emergency the new normal. The timing was tellingly precise. The 2023 migration spike arrived just as the nationalist Finns party was settling into power. They used the Russian threat to push through policies that would have been politically impossible under normal circumstances. By March 2025, the government further increased the presence of Frontex, the EU border agency, and Finnish border guard patrols. They deployed thermal imaging drones, K9 units, and even considered activating army reserves to assist in border control. The 1,340-kilometer border was no longer a line on a map. It was an actively defended barrier, monitored every square meter by high-tech sensors. The humanitarian cost of this success was externalized. Those 1,300 people who crossed in late 2023 were stuck in legal limbo, with many being deported back to Russia or their home countries. Thousands more who would have sought safety in Finland were pushed toward more dangerous routes or remained trapped in Belarus and Russia, where they faced exploitation and violence. Finland solved its crisis by making it a neighbor's problem. They weaponized the law to avoid international obligations, and they did it with the acceptance of the EU. Other countries are now replicating this formula. Italy is experimenting with offshore processing deals in Albania. Denmark has passed laws allowing deportations to undefined third countries. The playbook is public, and the guardrails are crumbling. The frozen Finnish-Russian border is silent today. Drone footage shows snow-covered forests and empty crossing points. No migrants, no arrivals, no crisis. Finland calls this a victory. They have protected their border and deterred the Kremlin's hybrid tactics. But if you zoom out, a different picture emerges. A NATO member that responded to a small group of people by shutting down an entire asylum system. A country that showed that with the right framing and the right enemy, human rights become negotiable. The right to seek asylum, enshrined in international law since the end of World War II, is now conditional, negotiable, and in many places, suspended. Finland's story is dangerous because it provides the legal and political template for a continent that is closing its gates. It proves that you can turn people into weapons and call it hybrid warfare. You can suspend human rights and call it security. And the rest of the world is taking notes. Finland solved its immigration crisis, but it did so by eroding the very values it claimed to be defending. The silent forest in Vaalimaa is the new reality of the 2026 world order. The gates are closed, and for Finland, the change is permanent. Good intentions do not secure a future. Logistics do. This is axial.